Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhearn.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
So we're recording this podcast a day early. Now, today is Monday, May 6th, and this podcast will come out, I believe, on the 37th of May. Is that it?
The 37th of May, yes. The 17th of May.
May 17th, 11 days later. So that's how we do it. We usually record on Tuesday and release a week from Friday after. It gives us a lot of time to edit because we're so busy. But we're recording on Monday today because tomorrow, but you already know this because of the miracle of time travel, Apple will have had introduced new iPads and a new Apple Pencil. And we were worried that our recording time would conflict with the time of Apple's event, and some of us may have to write about Apple's event, etc. It turns out, with the miracle of time travel, that Apple will have had spent a mere 35 minutes presenting the new products. So we could have actually watched the Apple event and then talked about the iPads on the podcast. But I think what we'll do is we'll talk about the iPads on the next episode of the podcast when one of us might have a new iPad. Are you tempted?
I am not tempted, but I say that, I mean, we have documented history here on this podcast. No, I'm not tempted by anything that Apple does. And then they release a new MacBook Pro and I get a MacBook Pro. So I am not sorely tempted because the current iPad dilemma stands, which is it does everything that I need it to do. It has more processing power than I use. And like there's not much there that would compel me to shell out $1,000, $900, $600 with the trade-in, whatever it's going to be. It's just not a high priority right now. So I'm hoping that they, come out with not only interesting new hardware, but a good reason for getting something new.
And you say this is someone who wrote a book about the iPad for photographers back in the day.
It's true. I did. And like the iPad is still great for photographers. And the iPad that I have, which is, I bought the M1. I mean, this is actually a really good example of what you said. I did not need a new iPad. And then they came out with the M1 based iPad in 2021, I think it was. And I figured, okay, I can get a good trade-in for my other one. I'll just use this. And that way I will be ready for whatever new thing they're going to do. And the new things that they've done are, Final Cut on the iPad, which I honestly haven't needed to use. But everything else is stuff that I could do on the other one. So it's been nice to have, but this one's still good. I'm not going to give it up. I say this right now before the event. I'm not going to give this up, and then we'll see what happens.
Well, it's important to note that we just did an episode about gear acquisition syndrome for our last episode, so this ties in quite well. I have two iPads. I have an iPad Pro 11-inch, and I have an iPad mini, and I looked up the iPad mini came out in September 2021. That's 2.5 years. The iPad mini is the one that I use literally every day. The iPad Pro is too big, too heavy. It's good if I'm editing articles, but I do that less and less. So I could be tempted. Apparently there's going to be a new iPad mini, smaller bezels, bigger display. I could be tempted by that. A larger iPad, the only thing that could tempt me is if it has an M4 chip and it's going to be able to do things that I can't do on my M1 iMac or my is it M2 or M3 MacBook Air? My M2 MacBook Air. In other words, if the chip is more advanced when Apple's AI tools come out, then maybe it might be useful to have an iPad Pro with an M4, which is what the rumors say.
Yeah. No, that is all very good, solid, standard thinking. This is like the corollary to gear acquisition syndrome is the I've been burned before syndrome. And I feel like for a lot of people, the iPad and the iPad Pro is like that. I bought this. I didn't need to buy it. It's been a perfectly fine device. I honestly, I also use it every day, but not extensively. It's never replaced my laptop. It's never, gone into that direction. And so Apple's burden is to provide even more reason why a new device is needed, other than maybe for people who have, an iPad that they've been holding on to for 5 or 6 years, then that makes sense. But, maybe not even that. I don't know. It's the gear burned syndrome.
It's a good point because the iPad is still seeking its niche in a way. I know people who don't have computers and use iPads regularly.
Mm-hmm.
Us who have many computers, the iPad is an appendage that's not necessarily that useful.
Yeah.
I can't help but think that the iPad Pro is overpriced because it's not a full computer, but it's priced like a full computer.
Yeah.
Whereas I like the iPad Mini and the iPad Air. Even the iPad Air has been creeping up in price. They used to have like a $300 iPad, and now everything's much more than that. I think the last iPad Mini was $499. So it's getting excessive, but we'll see. We will have seen by tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fun to speculate on the thing that already happened. And I love the fact that you already know that it was a 35-minute event. And that's also the magic of editing. You can be like, just because you're recording this episode, you'll just re-record that bit. And you're like, wow, how did he know that it was exactly 38.6 minutes? Amazing.
This is the rumors, and there are pretty reliable rumors. A guy named Mark Gurman, who is Apple's favorite leaky.
Mm-hmm.
He gets leaks from a lot of people, and he's generally Apple doesn't like leaks, and yet somehow they don't mind that Mark Gurman publishes all this stuff with like pretty precise specs on what's coming out. So it's clear that he's being given information that Apple wants to share. In some ways, Apple likes giving this information out because it might get more people to watch the event. In any case, it starts at 7 a.m. in California, which is the earliest I think they've ever done one of these, which is 3 p.m. for me. The last one started at 4 or 5 p.m. in California, so it was like 11 o'clock at night for me. They're switching the time around. I think they're trying to give different parts of the world a primetime view of an Apple event, but if it's only 35 minutes, it's not like you're, seeing a song and dance routine or something that's going to last an hour or two.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, let's get to our main topic. And before we started, you said to me, we have something in our notes about photography criticism. What is that about? And so this came from a discussion we had before or after a recording where you asked me, because I read all these books, you asked me, is there a good body of criticism about photography? And I had to answer no, in the sense that, and then I'm not talking about journals, and I'm not talking about, that end of the academic photography, right? I'm talking about the kind of books that are accessible to everyone. There's plenty of art criticism accessible to everyone. There's plenty of music criticism, but there's very little about photography. And it's actually interesting to question why. So I'm going to talk through a number of books that are worth looking at, but with the caveat that there's no real body of criticism of photography for neophytes, people interested in photography as an art.
Yeah.
Would that be the best way to say it?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, for me, the root of this conversation was, and maybe this was when we were looking at the photo book in one of our previous episodes, that big book that is called The Photo Book. And as listeners know, we have two different backgrounds when it comes to photography. My experience is more practical shooting and editing. Yours is a lot more of the history and the art side, like art with a capital A side of photography. That's what you've been more interested in. And so it brought up the question of, when you come across a photo, specifically like a street photo, an older photo, things that when you look at it now, you say, that's not a real exceptional photo. It's a blurry image of a guy jumping over a puddle, to use the same example that we used in that previous episode. Like, why is this a good image? And we touched on some of that. Some of it is because of the historical nature. At the time, you just did not have a whole bunch of those. Nowadays, you can have all sorts of blurry street photos of bad composition and like black and white does not make a good photo by itself. But that led me to think, well, what does? Like, when I'm looking at some photography that is allegedly good, sometimes I just don't see it. And actually, as a good example, I was in Stockholm last month on vacation, and I went to the Fotografiska Museum, it's just a museum of photography. It was splendid. I loved it. But they had one of the photographers who was on exhibit there did absolutely nothing for me. I thought all the photos were like very pedestrian and could not figure out why she was sort of enlarged into this larger exhibit. And even a video that had her and she was being interviewed, and it was all very, this is my process and this is how I approach things. And like, I respect that, but the photos themselves did not seem like anything exceptional. They were very, very pedestrian, other than they were printed very large. And so that just has this inner turmoil of mine as a photographer. I want to know what makes a good photo. And so I asked you, like, what sort of resources are there for this? And I think that's what generated the idea for this episode.
It's the real question is what gets a photograph into a museum? And the first thing to notice is that there aren't many museums that have photographs, right? There are museums of photography. There's one in Stockholm. There's one in New York. The Museum of Modern Art has photographs, or a number of museums, but photographs are never the centerpiece of art museums. It's art.
Right.
It's painting, it's sculpture, it's drawings. It's not photographs. They're seen as a lesser art, maybe because they're easily reproduced. You make one painting. Of course, you could manually copy it, but with photos, you can print as many as you want. So the uniqueness of photography isn't there, right? You can't say this is the one photo. Now, maybe some photographer is going to make one print, destroy the negative, put it in a museum. That's an exception, right? That's a gimmick, right? But it's true that photography, how does photography get there? I subscribed to the British Journal of Photography for a year or two, some years ago, and it was academic photography in the sense, like you're saying, why are these photos? It was the style of deadpan portraits, which seems to be a style in photography these days and is boring. Or it was a style of highly, what's the word? Produced in the sense of props and positions and lighting, the kind of that sort of thing, the fancy photographs.
Very meticulous, very staged kind of.
Right, staged photograph. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Or it was pictures of people wearing, I don't know, buckets on their heads, right? Because it was supposed to make some sort of statement. And these aren't the things that are going to survive, right, over time. But these are the things that tend to be the flavor of the month and that among academic circles, people are into. But how do you get from academia and the people who think about art? There must be some, right, who look at photography. How do you get from that to the people who are just interested in photography like us? And there's a big gulf, it seems, that you can go to a photo museum and really not have a clue. And believe me, when I see a lot of the stuff that's exposed in Aperture, for example, the magazine, you'll see, portfolio by different photographers, and you have to wonder. But of course, this brings me back to 1976 and William Eggleston's first exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, when the curator, John Sharkowski, selected 75 photos and showed them in the museum. And it was one of the first shocking photo exhibits, not porn or anything. It's not violent. It was William Eggleston's banal photos, which I reference very often because I'm very moved by that sort of photography. There's something in it that grabs me. And one curator in a museum was enough to be able to elevate his photography and make people look at it. Now, you have to understand that in the art world and the photography world, the main driver of, I want to say, attention is collectors. How much is someone going to pay for a photograph or a painting? If they pay a lot for a painting, that makes it better. And then someone's going to write something about the painting and the artist. And it's like a self-fulfilling cycle. Photography does not sell for as much as painting does. So maybe it just doesn't elicit that kind of artistic industrial complex, right? Where you've got this circular economy of people buying and selling and people trying to talk you into buying and selling.
You mentioned that one curator exhibited into a museum, but it wasn't just any museum. It was the Museum of Modern Art. So just that action elevates whatever the material is. And I mean, honestly, cynically, the material could be junk, but if somebody likes it and they elevate it, then that gets other curators, collectors, journalists, art students, aficionados, like that puts that into the conversation, quote unquote.
Exactly.
So that like moves things up, which was kind of the feeling that I got with the exhibit. And I just checked the website. The exhibit's no longer there, but I believe that the photographer's name was Ryoko. I'll have to look it up. We'll put it in the show notes. But for me, cynically, again, I got the sense that I believe that she's here because she has been exhibited elsewhere. And you get exhibited in a good place, and then maybe in a better place, and then in a better place. And then somehow people can make a living by selling giant photos that may not be any more exceptional than what somebody who has not had that process go through, right? Is that entirely too cynical, or does that just sum up art throughout history?
No, I think that's the art market. Remember, if you go back to the early paintings, after paintings left the church, right? In the Flemish countries in pre-Renaissance, there were portraits that you would have in your house that would show someone of your family, or a burgmeister would get a portrait of his wife and show off that I've got a portrait by this painter. And it was a similar thing that, oh, I got a portrait by this painter. He would be able to take the time to make my wife's portrait and all that. So art has often been a look at me type of thing. And photography, in its reproducibility and its simplicity, it only takes a second to take a photograph. That doesn't mean that a photograph is only a second in conception, in the number of shots someone's taken to find a good one, in the amount of time in the darkroom, etc. But it only takes a second. So it seems like it's, I want to say, cheaper in the sense that there's less weight going into it.
Well, and also the perception of less weight. People say, oh, well, I have a camera, I could probably make that. Rather than I have some oil paints and I could just reproduce this painting, which is scads different. Even if you could not reproduce this picture with your photo and your old Canon DSLR, but a lot of people think that they can because it's more accessible, perhaps.
I'll tell you, it's easier to reproduce a painting than it is to reproduce a photograph. And when you go to a big art museum, you see art students with easels and paints who are copying paintings. And this is one way that they learn. They learn by copying the masters and learning how the brushstrokes go and how the colors work and all that. It's considered to be a part of the education being a painter. You can't really do that as a photographer because it's real life that changes. The light changes every second. The people around change. The atmosphere changes. You can only capture that once. Whereas in a painting, an artist may spend months on a painting. They may go out and make a sketch of a landscape and then go back to their studio and paint it slowly. Go back again to look at the light in the landscape and come back and take their time presenting their interpretation of what they saw. Photography is what's there, and that's very different.
This episode is brought to you by Nitro, the brand new photo editor and manager from the developer of Raw Power. Designed for every photographer and every photograph, Nitro combines flexible storage options, unmatched camera support, and professional editing tools. If you liked Aperture or Raw Power, you'll love Nitro. On the editing side, Nitro includes full masking support with AI masks, gradients, and brushes. Remove dust blemishes and other imperfections using clone and spot removal tools. And, just like Raw Power, you can apply RAW-specific tone and tuning adjustments. Nitro gives you more control over Apple's RAW decoder than any other app. For organizing, your photos can live in Apple's Photos library or in the file system, with support for XMP sidecars and synchronizing metadata and edits with iCloud Photo Library. Nitro also supports more cameras and formats than Photos, Darkroom, or Photomator, including compressed Fujifilm RAW files. And while comparing shots, synchronize, pan, and zoom up to 16 images at a time. Try Nitro for free for 7 days without any obligation. No subscription sign-up, no nonsense. check it out at nitrophoto.app. That's nitrophoto.app.
I want to mention a few books that are interesting. John Berger did a series for the BBC in, I believe, 1972. It's called Ways of Seeing, and it was a very popular series because it was the first time that the BBC had something teaching people how to look at art, and that's what John Berger was doing. He was a novelist and a critic, and it was an extremely influential series in the fact that he had recently won the Booker Prize for a novel, and then here he was on TV telling people how art works. And now this is not particular to photography. By the way, I'll put a link in the show notes to a website where you can see all the text and the still images from the series. You can't see the original videos might be on YouTube. They're old, they're black and white, I believe. But you can at least get an idea of what it is. So he didn't really talk about photography, but there is a book that was published a few years ago called Understanding a Photograph by John Berger. Now, he didn't write this book. It's a collection of articles and essays, which was edited and introduced by Jeff Dyer, who I'll mention in just a moment. It's not a book where he starts at the beginning and goes to the end. Again, it's a collection of articles and essays, and it doesn't really necessarily cover everything. It's an interesting book. You might get some interesting ideas. A lot of what this sort of book talks about is composition, though, rather than... I want to give an example. I mentioned before the show, I'm reading this book called Earthly Delights by Jonathan Jones. The subtitle is A History of the Renaissance. And what it is looking at art in the Renaissance and how this art influenced society and how society influenced art. And there's like a particular example of a painting that got lost being sent between Bruges and Italy. And if it hadn't been lost, it would have changed Italian art because it was so groundbreaking. And the kind of paintings that were coming from the North countries down to Italy that influenced the Italian Renaissance had a huge effect on art, and then on poetry and literature, etc., and eventually music. So this sort of criticism you can't really do about photography because where do you start? Well, you can start in the 1860s with daguerreotypes, and they're not that interesting. You can go into the early 20th century where you've got view cameras and people, you put the sheet over your head and you take the picture and you can't move. And then you can get a little bit further till you have portable cameras, which is after World War II, roughly, the early Leicas. They started being produced like the 20s or the 30s, but they became more common after World War II. So up until that time, you didn't have a lot of photography. You had Eugène Atget, whose photos of Paris, late 19th, early 20th century with a big still camera, did set a certain tone for photos of a city. But you didn't have the portability of photography for a while. Once that came in, it changed everything because the photographer was setting up the camera on the tripod, big, heavy camera. These weighed like 20, 30 pounds, the same way a painter was setting up the easel wherever he was making his composition. And it was a slow process. It was carefully thought out. The photographic plates were probably expensive. Developing was expensive. You didn't have a roll of 36. You had to carry around a half a dozen. So the intention of the photography was extremely different. In fact, the intention was, how can I make a photograph that's like a painting? Because that was the early dichotomy between painting and photography. Photography captures reality in a moment, but the early photographers wanted it to be like painting.
Well, and also, again, I'm projecting onto this, but those early days were very technical and very technological because here was this new technology that allowed you to capture life without painting it. And so I suspect that a lot of it wasn't necessarily how can I make art out of this, but how can I capture this? Because this is such a novel thing that I can do. I can just take a picture of people in the street and, provided I have enough light, I can do it fast enough that everybody's not moving. Like what an amazing thing to do. And so it seems to me that once you add more to it, you have more people shooting, more people with cameras, more access to the technology, then more art creeps in because you have to ask yourself, I'm not just documenting these things that other people have never seen or that maybe, all the people in New York don't know what the Wild West looks like. And so I can document that. later on, you have more people creating more photos. Now, how can I make my images look better or be more artistic or playing with light, et cetera, et cetera? And then you move up to where we are, where there are so many images everywhere that it feels like everything has been seen. So how do I make a photo that is different in some way and is quote unquote artistic rather than just a documentary snapshot? Now, I'm sure historians and art critics would listen to that and be like, wow, do you have a very narrow view of artistic history? Which, like I said that in over the course of a minute. So, like all those caveats in place, I understand. But it feels like there's a lot of truth to it.
Well, you have a degree in potato farming, so it's understandable that you don't have the right lingo.
I never actually did any potato farming. That was all happening outside my town that I grew up in.
Okay. I think what you're saying is interesting because, again, they were nerds, the early ones, right? The photographers. They had this technique that they were messing with. They were like computer nerds back then. They were reproducing. And so after a while, it got to the point of, well, what can we do that's not reproducing? And you look at Ansel Adams when he went out west and he really worked with the light and the development process in the darkroom to refine the photos. And he was looking at the contrast and the subtleties of light and catching pictures at just the right time. It's still a reproduction of reality. And then you go ahead to people who started doing staged photos, and often the fashion industry actually had some quite radical photographers in it. But you just don't have the weight of history. And that, I think, is the problem with photography. I would love to see a good volume of criticism, like the book we talked about, the photo book. What makes these photos so special, other than we've seen them a lot, and some of them are photos you've seen a lot. It's a photographer who's well respected, things like that. So I want to mention my favorite photo book of all time. It's called The Street Philosophy of Gary Winogrand. Gary Winogrand is a photographer who also benefited from an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. And his was in 1969, 1970, the first exhibit by Gary Winogrand. So he was a street photographer, and he was a bit strange. I'll put a link in the show notes to a documentary about him. And if you can see it, it's like he just out there taking pictures. He died with thousands of rolls undeveloped that no one ever saw. And, he just liked the process of confronting people, not in a violent way, but confronting people on the street and capturing things. So this book is written and edited by Jeff Dyer, again, who's pretty much the only person writing about photography for the general public. And he selected 100 photos, and what he does for each photo is he talks about what was happening in the photo. And he makes up characters for the photos. And the woman in photo 4, he says, is the same one in photo 63, even though it's not. But maybe in the mind of a viewer, it could have been the same woman in the same situation. Winogrand took a lot of pictures of women and was a bit criticized for his way of sexualizing women. But this approach to photography, which gives it a sort of a playful aspect, is really interesting. It lets you look at the relationship between 100 photos by the same photographer over much of his career and what's common about them and what's unique in different photos. 2 other books by Jeff Dyer, The Ongoing Moment, which is more of an analysis of, here's a photo, I'm looking at it, I'm talking about the why and the what and the where, and that's close to the kind of photography criticism that we want. A more recent book called Seesaw, which is a collection of essays, and all of these collections of essays may have some interesting stuff, but it's not programmatic. It's not, here's a book on understanding what makes good photography good. We're moved by composition, right? And in fact, a lot of the books that you would look up if you're looking like, what is the art of photography, will be about composition, about the way I like to say, the way you position the 4 corners of the frame when you take a picture. You don't always have a lot of options. If you're staging something in a studio, yes, you can do whatever you want. But if not, you have to just put the frame out there, and there's things that might be in the way. Composition is only part of art. There's a lot more to it. There's technique. And of course, in painting and other types of visual art, you have techniques that you don't necessarily have in photography. There's also influences. One painter is influenced by another painter. Photographers are influenced by other photographers. It's without doubt that photographers know what other photographers are doing. There's a time when Joel Meyerowitz shifted from black and white to color photography, And a lot of photographers followed because they'd been doing this black and white street photography for a long time. And Joel Meyerowitz bought a view camera, went up to Cape Cod, did these serene pictures that were nothing like the movement that he captured in New York. What makes it art? You look at a picture and you're moved. I'm looking at a picture of Miles Davis playing in a club. It's a wonderfully composed picture. I'll put a link in the show notes. I bought the poster from Magnum Photos. Dennis Stock is the photographer. It's a capture of a moment, and he's playing, and you can see the music coming out. But is that art? That's really the question. Is it art?
Well, here we are, just like in the beginning, asking the same question: is it art? I
would argue that yes. I didn't mention Susan Sontag's On Photography, a book in the 70s, which was highly influential. I reread it a couple years ago, and there's a chapter about there's so many images out there. We're just flooded with images. If she only knew where we would get to. And this was because people had Instamatic cameras, and it was easy to take photos. And now we've gotten to the point. It's you don't see a lot of paintings. You don't see paintings all over the place. You don't go to someone's house and they say, "Ooh, let's sit down and I'll show you all my paintings on the wall," right? You don't see that because paintings are manual. They require a lot of work. You can see tons of photographs. Maybe that dilutes the value of photography as an art as well.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, what I like about this topic is that it is something we can keep revisiting. I mean, as you were talking,
when we have nothing else to talk about, yes, we can keep revisiting.
We have nothing else to talk about. Well, like the thing that came to mind while you were talking was how, some photographers are influencing other photographers. And I'm sure that we are going to look back on the last, like, say, 10 years, 5 years, 8 years, and see how a lot of photography changed because of Instagram and influencers and, so many pictures of single people standing on the edge of a cliff in front of a giant epic landscape, right? Like before, you would just take a picture of the epic landscape, but then you had to have somebody standing with a very large hat. And, like that is a style that got widely copied and I think is sort of falling out of favor now just because of pure saturation. But I think that's an example of photography that has evolved from what other people have done and building and moving and rippling and just, it's an ongoing living thing.
But that doesn't make it art. I don't think selfies can be art, by the way. Selfies can be. There's certainly a possibility.
Yeah. Not necessarily a selfie, but just, having somebody staged in that way where you see a lot of the same kinds of photos. And I have no doubt that some of it is artistic, some of it is copying. But then again, that's kind of how art is, right? We're just on a much larger scale.
Right. You don't see hordes of people with their easels out in front of, El Capitan in Yosemite making paintings. You might see one if you go there, but you'll see a line of people wanting to take photographs.
Yeah.
But that's a big difference between painting, let's say painting, which could include drawing or watercolors or pastels or whatever, visual art, and photography where snap, click, and you got your picture, compared to hours and hours of painting. So that gives it's a bit unbalanced. Anyway, we don't have an answer. If anyone does know a good book on criticism of photography, please write into the podcast because I'm very curious. I have looked. I've read a book by someone with a name I can't pronounce called The Philosophy of Photography and could not make head nor tails of it because it was this sort of postmodernist thing about the photography of capturing images and stuff. And it didn't talk about art. It talked about I don't even know what it talked about. Didn't really understand much of the book. So I'm definitely interested in anything that may exist. But, the thing remains that you can go out and find books and go to museums. And that book, we'll put a link in the show notes to the episode about the photo book. Poorly named for SEO purposes, the photo book, but it has hundreds of photos by well-known photographers. So as long as we're talking about snapshots, Jeff, do you have a snapshot?
I do have a snapshot. My snapshot is software. It has nothing to do with any of this. It is an application. Actually, it's a utility called Peek2 Search. So we talked to the people from, Cyme, 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 Cyme.
Cyme.
and we'll link to our interview with them. And they have a utility called Peek 2, which we covered, that lets you view photos in all of your libraries, even if it's not the same application. And they just recently released in the last couple of weeks a utility that works as a Lightroom or a Capture One plugin that sort of offers the same thing, where it will scan all of your images and use AI to build an index of what's in those images and let you search those. So even if you never keyworded, you never did any sort of metadata tagging, anything like that, you could type something like, I want to find 2 people on a beach, and it would bring up results showing 2 people on a beach or 2 people or beach. Like, there are controls for setting how strict it should interpret the search request. I actually wrote an article about this for DP Review, which I'll also include in the show notes. It's a very cool utility. It's a 1.0. It tends to really chew processing power in the background sometimes. And so, like, that doesn't make me not recommend it. It just means every once in a while I just quit it, because as happened when we started this podcast, Zoom was like super jittery, and I realized, Peek 2 search was hitting was rebuilding its index in the background. It was just taking over all of my processes. But anyway, it's very cool. I don't have the pricing offhand. They have various options for monthly or yearly, or you could pay a flat rate for it. But if you're a Lightroom Classic or Capture One user, and you want this sort of search functionality, especially across multiple catalogs, multiple libraries, it's very well done. Kirk, what do you have this week?
Well, I'm going to use the book that I mentioned before, Jonathan Jones's book, Earthly Delights, A History of the Renaissance. It looks at paintings and says, why did the artist include this? Why does this person figure in this picture? Why did Hieronymus Bosch include all of these strange characters? What's going on? So it's talking about the social elements of painting. It's talking about the context of the time. And if you know anything about Flemish painting, Renaissance painting, Italian Renaissance, it's really quite stunning to see, to learn a little bit more. Now, I've always been the kind of person who feels that if you need a story to understand art, then the art doesn't exist on its own. And this is particular with modern art, when you'd see a exhibit of modern art. Well, you have to know that the painter was doing this because of this. And it's like, no, if it doesn't talk to you, it doesn't talk to you. But these are works of art that are already beautifully done. It's not like here's just a few slashes of color across a canvas and they represent the deep repressed memories of the artist or something like this. It's paintings that are representational. They are paintings of things, of people, of places, and all that. And what is the visual language that's going on? How does that reflect society, and how did it influence society? So, wonderful book, Earthly Delights, History of the Renaissance.
Sounds great.
In our next episode, we will look at Jeff's bank account and see how many iPads he has purchased. But see, I've already admitted I might buy an iPad mini if the price is right, and if I can get a good enough trade-in or sell it some way. I like the iPad mini.
Yeah. All right. We will see what happens.
Okay. Thanks for listening to Photoactive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photoactive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast app.